Tilda, we've been hearing a lot recently about the left-right political divide in academia. More specifically about the left-right divide in the soft sciences, things like sociology and psychology. Even more specifically about the total lack of diversity within those fields with regards to political opinion, with numerous sources pointing out that people with left-wing or liberal values outnumber people with right-wing or conservative values by a very large margin. And people on the political left often like to sweep this issue under the rug, with the more progressive leftists often claiming that this is a conspiracy theory concocted by right-wing misogynist, racist, bigoted MRA gamergators who are just angry at the changes in the world that they see around them and being upset little crybabies because they're losing their privilege, or some variation thereof. So today we're going to be looking at a paper from the Cambridge journals Behavioral and Brain Sciences, titled Political Diversity Will Improve Social Psychological Science, which is to date the largest study of its kind looking at political diversity within the social sciences, and the various pitfalls and problems that the homogeneity of political belief within these fields is having. Psychologists have demonstrated the value of diversity, particularly diversity of viewpoints, for enhancing creativity, discovery, and problem-solving. But one key type of viewpoint diversity is lacking in academic psychology in general, and social psychology in particular, political diversity. This article reviews the available evidence and finds support for 4 claims. 1. Academic psychology has had considerable political diversity, but has lost nearly all of it within the last 50 years. 2. This lack of political diversity can undermine the validity of social psychological sciences via mechanisms such as the embedding of liberal values into research questions and methods, steering researchers away from important but politically unpalatable research topics, and producing conclusions that mischaracterize liberals and conservatives alike. 3. Increased political diversity would improve social psychological science by reducing the impact of bias mechanisms, such as confirmation bias, and by empowering dissenting minorities to improve the quality of the majority's thinking. And 4. The underrepresentation of non-liberals in social psychology is more likely due to a combination of self-selection, hostile climate, and discrimination. So with that abstract out of the way, we're going to have a look through some of the key findings of this particular study. In the last few years, social psychology has faced a series of challenges to the validity of its research, including a few high-profile replication failures, a handful of fraud cases, and several articles on questionable research practices and inflated effect sizes. Regular followers of this channel will have seen several examples of this highlighted in other videos that I've done. And you may also be aware of a study conducted not all that long ago, estimating the reproducibility of psychological science, published in the journal Science, which attempted to replicate 100 experiments reported in papers published in 2008 in 3 high-ranking psychological journals, and somewhat shook the boat of the establishment of psychology when it found that only about half of those studies could actually be replicated, with a goodly portion of the half that could be replicated yielding results that were still significantly questionable. In response, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology convened a task force on publication and research practices, which provided a set of statistical, methodological, and practical recommendations intended to both limit integrity failures and broadly increase the robustness and validity of social psychology. In this article, we suggest that one largely overlooked cause of failure is a lack of political diversity. We review evidence suggesting that political diversity and dissent would improve the reliability and validity of social psychological science. Psychology is less politically diverse than ever. There are many academic fields in which surveys find self-identified conservatives to be about as numerous as self-identified liberals, typically business, computer science, engineering, health sciences, and technical vocational fields. In the social sciences and humanities, however, there is a stronger imbalance. For instance, recent surveys find that between 58 and 66% of social science professors in the United States identify as liberals, while only 5 to 8% identify as conservatives, and that self-identified Democrats outnumber Republicans by ratios of at least 8 to 1. A similar situation is found in the humanities, where a survey finds that 52 to 77% of humanities professors identify as liberals, while only 4 to 8% identify as conservatives, and that self-identified Democrats outnumber Republicans by a ratio of at least 5 to 1. In psychology, the imbalance is slightly stronger. 84% identified as liberal, while only 8% identified as conservative. that is a ratio of 10.5 to 1. In the United States as a whole, the ratio of liberals to conservatives is roughly 1 to 2. So as you can see, within academia, there is a distinctly large left-leaning bias in these social sciences. And we're going to start covering why that is a little bit of a problem later. However, I think it's important to establish whether or not this has always been the case. So how exactly are we going to measure this? Well, political leaning surveys have historically not really been a thing, but there are ways around this which are somewhat imperfect, but it will give us a bit of a picture of the past. Basically, what our researchers have done is go back to the 1920s and then look forward, and at various intervals they have looked at the party identification of various people within academia from a wide number of sources. Now, this is imperfect because party identification does not necessarily correlate completely with the left-right dimension as we know it, because liberal Republicans are a thing and conservative Democrats are a thing. But knowing whether or not they are affiliated with Democrats or Republicans is at least a starting point, and in lieu of the creation of a time machine, it's pretty much the best that we're going to be able to do. And once these findings are plotted out on a graph, it looks something like this. So let me quickly explain what's going on. Circles are the ratios of self-report of liberal versus conservative, diamonds show the ratios of self-reports of party preference or voting, and the open diamonds is the recollection of whom people voted for in the past. Basically, on this graph, the higher up a point is, the higher the Democrat to Republican ratio is. So the further up on the scale the point is, the more Democrats there are to Republicans. So as you can see, in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, the ratio was a little skewed in favor of Democrat, but not by very much. But as you can see towards the late 1900s and into the early 2000s, we can start seeing a massive shift in favor of the liberal side. So this left-leaning political shift within the social sciences is very real. But is it inherently a problem to have a group of people who all share a similar political bias working together? Well, let's have a look, shall we? 3 ways that a lack of diversity undermines social psychology. If left unchecked, an academic field can become a cohesive moral community, creating a shared reality that subsequently blinds its members to morally or ideologically undesirable hypotheses and unanswered but important scientific questions. This is another thing that I've touched on this channel before, especially in my talks with Stardust, that there are just certain topics in certain fields of study that you're simply not really allowed to ever look at. Certain experiments that will simply never be funded because they're a little bit too awkward, and that there's certain areas of study, especially in regards to things such as human behavior, where there is sparse research yet surprisingly compelling findings, often very consistent and easily replicatable, but that simply fall by the wayside because they are politically incorrect to explore. Sociologist Christian Smith in 2003 has looked at moral communities and the effects that it has on academia, regarding moral narratives and the links that it has to researchers' conceptions of history and their own research. And he described the left-leaning field of sociology as sharing what he calls a liberal progress narrative, which can be summed up as follows. Once upon a time, the vast majority of human persons suffered in societies and social institutions that were unjust, unhealthy, repressive, and oppressive. These traditional societies were reprehensible because of their deep-rooted inequality, exploitation, and irrational traditionalism. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity struggled mightily against the forces of misery and oppression, and eventually succeeded in establishing modern, liberal, democratic welfare societies. While modern social conditions hold the potential to maximize the individual freedom and pleasure of all, there is much work to be done to dismantle the power vestiges of inequality, exploitation, and repression. This struggle for the good society in which individuals are equal and free to pursue their self-defined happiness is the one mission truly worth dedicating one's life to achieving. Our paper's authors note that although Smith wrote this narrative for sociology, it is a plausible shared narrative for social psychology, a field that has produced copious research on racism, sexism, stereotypes, and the baneful effects of power and obedience to authority. Given the political homogeneity demonstrated in Section 1 of this paper, the field of social psychology is at risk of becoming a cohesive moral community. They then question whether or not this moral historical narrative and the political homogeneity of the field causes some sort of self-correction process, which will lead to biases within the field. And they go on to suggest 3 ways that this could cause problems, which we're going to look at quickly right about now. Risk point number 1. Liberal values and assumptions can become embedded into theory and method. Political values can become embedded into research questions in ways that make some constructs unobservable and unmeasurable, thereby invalidating attempts at hypothesis testing. The embedding of values occurs when value statements or ideological claims are wrongly treated as objective truth, and observed deviation from that truth is treated as error. In this paper, they give 2 examples with multiple constructs. For the sake of brevity, we're going to look at example 1's first construct and example 2 in brief. So example 1 is the denial of environmental realities. Fagener-Jost and Goldstein in 2010 sought to explain the denial of environmental realities using system justification theory. In operationalizing such denial, the authors assessed the 4 constructs listed below, with example items in parentheses. Remember, we're only going to be looking at construct 1 and the problems within for the sake of brevity. Construct 1 was the denial of the possibility of an ecological crisis. If things continue on their present course, we will soon experience a major environmental catastrophe. The core problem with this research is that it misrepresents those who merely disagree with environmentalist values and slogans as being in denial. Indeed, the papers Fagener et al. Cited in support of their denial questions never used the term deny or denial to describe these measures. Clark, Cochin and Moore 2003 referred to the items as assessing attitudes, and Dunlap, Van Leer, Mettig and Jones 2000 characterized the items as tapping primitive beliefs about the environment. The term denial implies that 1. The claim being denied is a reality, that is a descriptive fact, and that 2. Anyone who fails to endorse the pro-environmentalist side of these claims is engaging in a psychological process of denial. We next describe why both claims are false and why the measures, however good they are at assessing attitudes or primitive beliefs, fail to assess denial. In the case of construct 1, it refers to a possibility, so that denial would be a belief that an ecological crisis was impossible. This was not assessed, and the measure that supposedly tapped this construct refers to no descriptive fact. Without defining soon or major or crisis, it is impossible for this to be a fact. Without being a statement of an actual fact, disagreeing with the statement does not, indeed cannot, represent denial. So what we've got here, as you can see, is a shift of language based on variables that are never actually properly defined. As such, disagreeing with the original statement because of your own thoughts of what those variables could be has been constituted as denialism. The second example that they give is ideology and unethical behavior, from a study in 2007 which found that 1. People high in social dominance orientation, SDO, were more likely to make unethical decisions. 2. People high in right-wing authoritarianism, RWA, were more likely to go along with the unethical decisions of leaders. And 3. Dyads with high SDO leaders and high RWA followers made more unethical decisions than dyads with alternative arrangements, e.g. low SDO or low RWA dyads. Yet consider the decisions they defined as unethical. Not formally taking a female colleague's side in her sexual harassment complaint against her subordinate, given little information about the case, and a worker placing the well-being of his or her company above the unspecified harms to the environment attributed to the company's actions. Liberal values of feminism and environmentalism were embedded directly into the operationalizations of ethics, even to the extent that participants were expected to endorse those values in vignettes that lacked the information one would need to make a considered judgment. Basically, in regards to this example, they assessed the listen and believe attitude that their subjects had. If you were high in listen and believe, then you were judged to have taken the right course of action. If, however, you were low in the listen and believe, and you wanted some more evidence or context for the events, then you were deemed to be making an unethical decision. And this unethical decision was then linked to you being a right-wing authoritarian. Our authors suggest that there are methods by which you can recognize and avoid embedded value biases. The appearance of certain words that imply pernicious motives, e.g. deny, legitimize, rationalize, justify, defend, or trivialize, may be particularly indicative of research tainted with embedded values. Such terms imply, for example, that the view being denied is objectively valid and the view being justified is objectively invalid. So if you see anyone regularly using these terms in their arguments, be aware that they may be implying motive and possibly be using some embedded values of their own. Moving on to risk point number 2, researchers may concentrate on topics that validate the liberal progress narrative and avoid topics that contest that narrative. And the example for this one is just pure gold. Once again, for the sake of brevity, we're only going to be looking at one of the 2 examples. Specifically, example 1. Stereotype accuracy. Since the 1930s, social psychologists have been proclaiming the inaccuracy of social stereotypes, despite lacking evidence for such inaccuracies. Evidence has seemed unnecessary because stereotypes have been, in effect, stereotyped as inherently nasty and inaccurate. Some group stereotypes are indeed hopelessly crude and untestable, but some may rest on valid empiricism and represent subjective estimates of population characteristics, e.g., the proportion of people who drop out of high school, are victims of crime, or endorse policies that support women at work. In this context, it is not surprising that the rigorous empirical study of the accuracy of factual stereotypes was initiated by one of the very few self-avowed conservatives in social psychology, Clark Macaulay. Since then, dozens of studies by independent researchers have yielded evidence that stereotype accuracy for all sorts of stereotypes is one of the most robust effects in all of social psychology. Here is a clear example of the value of political diversity. A conservative social psychologist asked a question nobody else thought or dared to ask and found results that continue to make many social psychologists uncomfortable. Macaulay's willingness to put the assumption of stereotype inaccuracy to an empirical test led to the correction of one of social psychology's most long-standing errors. To explain this nice and clearly for people, the liberal progressive viewpoint was that stereotypes are always invalid because they are inaccurate and evil, and basically don't have any sort of shred of truth to them because they're just a social construct used to oppress people. And then a conservative social psychologist comes along, and this has since been verified by dozens of independent researchers, that stereotypes do in fact exist for a reason. And that often there is actual empirical evidence that suggests that the stereotype is at least partially correct or valid. That is to say that social attitudes towards certain things can actually be informed by what people witness on a daily basis. Who'd have thunk it? And finally, risk point 3, negative attitudes regarding conservatives can produce a psychological science that mischaracterizes their traits and attributes. A long-standing view in social political psychology is that the right is more dogmatic and intolerant of ambiguity than the left, a point of view that has been dubbed the rigidity of the right hypothesis. Altmaier in 1996 and 1998 argued that the consequence of this asymmetry in rigidity is that those on the right should be more prone to making biased political judgment than those on the left. For example, Altmaier in 1996 found that people high in right-wing authoritarianism were biased in favor of Christian over Muslim mandatory school prayer in American and Arab public schools respectively, whereas people low in right-wing authoritarianism opposed mandatory school prayer regardless of the religious target group. Others since then have relied on this evidence to make similar arguments regarding right-wing authoritarian rigidity. But had social psychologists studied a broad enough range of situations to justify these broad conclusions? Recent evidence suggests not. The ideological objectional premise model posits that people on the political left and right are equally likely to approach political judgment with their ideological blinders on. That said, they will only do so when the premise of the political judgment is ideologically acceptable. If it's objectionable, any preference for one group over another will be short-circuited and the biases won't emerge. The IOPM thus allows for biases to emerge only among liberals, only among conservatives, or among both liberals and conservatives depending on the situation. For example, reinterpreting Altmaier's mandatory school prayer results, Crawford in 2012 argued that for people low in right-wing authoritarianism who value individual freedom and autonomy, mandatory school prayer is objectionable. Thus, the very nature of the judgment should shut off any biases in favour of one target over the other. However, for people high in right-wing authoritarianism who value social-wide conformity to traditional morals and values, mandating school prayer is acceptable. This acceptance premise then allows for people high in right-wing authoritarianism to express a bias in favour of Christian over Muslim school prayer. Crawford in 2012 Study 1 replaced mandatory prayer with voluntary prayer, which would be acceptable to both people high and low in right-wing authoritarianism. In line with the IOPN, people high in right-wing authoritarianism were still biased in favor of Christian over Muslim prayer, while people low in right-wing authoritarianism now showed a bias in favor of Muslim over Christian voluntary prayer. Hypocrisy is therefore not necessarily a special province of the right. In another study, Crawford 2012 Study 2 reasoned that the left typically finds it acceptable to criticize and question authority. Therefore, a scenario involving a subordinate criticizing an authority figure would permit people low in right-wing authoritarianism to punish a subordinate who criticizes an ideologically similar leader, e.g. President Barack Obama, more harshly than one criticizes an ideologically dissimilar leader, e.g. President George W. Bush. However, such criticism of authority represents an objectionable premise for both people high in right-wing authoritarianism. Thus, they should punish the subordinate equally regardless of the leader's identity. Consistent with the IOPM, people low in right-wing authoritarianism more harshly punished a military general who criticized Obama than one who criticized Bush, whereas people high in right-wing authoritarianism punished the general equally regardless of the target leader's identity. Thus, this scenario shows the reverse of Altmaier's findings. Biases emerge among the left, but not the right. Results from 7 scenarios have supported the ideological objectional premise model and indicate that biased political judgments are not predicted by ideological orientation, but rather by the qualities of the judgment scenarios used in the research. So that was a really long segment to plow through, but all of it was relevant. Basically, the idea of someone having some sort of rigid moral view actually comes from the situation that they are in and not their political ideology, although the ideology might form part of their preference in those situations. But it is quite interesting to note that when it comes to in-group, out-group in regards to that punishment example, right-wing people were more likely to apply judgment evenly to everyone regardless of their political leanings, but the left-wing was more likely to be harsh to the out-group than the in-group. And that's something very important to bear in mind for later. And now we get to the really important part. Why do we even need to have diversity of opinion in the social psychological sciences? Well, according to our authors, diversity can be operationalized in many ways, including demographic diversity, e.g. ethnicity, race and gender, and viewpoint diversity, e.g. variations in intellectual viewpoints or professional expertise. Research in organizational psychology suggests that A, the benefits of viewpoint diversity are more consistent and more pronounced than those of demographic diversity, and B, the benefits of viewpoint diversity are more pronounced when organizations are pursuing open-ended exploratory goals, e.g. scientific discovery, as opposed to exploitative goals, e.g. applying well-established routines to well-defined problems. Oh dear, look out left-wing progressives. Identity politics is not as important as confronting people with different points of view to yourself. In fact, exposure to diversity of thought produces better results in the fields of study that you're trying to work in, as opposed to an ideological echo chamber where everyone looks different. But now we get to the key point here. We've already established that lack of diversity of thought in a subject is a real danger, leading to confirmation bias and simply not addressing things that are just inconvenient, and indeed even having research tainted by preconceived notions where beliefs are just treated as objective fact. So why are there fewer conservative or right-leaning people in the social sciences? Well, one explanation that's been offered is simply that liberals are smarter than conservatives. Unfortunately, the evidence does not support this viewpoint, and anyone who makes this claim is going to be subject to, you guessed it, confirmation bias, by breaking down intelligence into various types of category and then simply cherry-picking the ones in which liberals perform better than conservatives on aggregate, even if the score difference is negligible. So our researchers looked through a series of other studies, and they have found that social conservatism does correlate with a lower cognitive ability test score, but economic conservatism correlates with higher scores. Similarly, another study has found in multiple national representative samples that social conservatism negatively predicted educational attainment, but economic conservatism positively predicted educational attainment. Together, these results likely explain why other researchers have found a negative correlation between IQ and conservatism, because conservatism in those studies was operationalized as right-wing authoritarianism, which is more strongly related to social than economic conservatism. There's that confirmation bias and operation bias that we were talking about earlier. By defining your terms in a very specific way, you are able to get a specific outcome that does not necessarily reflect reality. To summarize the findings, substantial evidence suggests that the most reliable relationships between political orientation and intelligence are the positive correlation of both social liberalism and economic conservatism with verbal intelligence, while no consistent correlation emerges between political views and mathematical intelligence. This pattern is incompatible with the hypothesis that research psychologists are overwhelmingly left liberal because liberals are smarter than conservatives. So what about the concepts of differences in interest? Well, the big five trait that correlates most strongly with political liberalism is openness to experience, and people high in that trait are more likely to pursue careers that will let them indulge their curiosity and desire to learn, such as a career in the academy. An academic career requires a PhD, and liberals enter and graduate college more interested in pursuing PhDs than do conservatives. Furthermore, the personal and intellectual priorities of liberals may predispose them to an academic career relative to conservatives. They are less interested in financial success and more interested in writing original works and making a theoretical contribution to science. But then we come to a rather interesting effect, the birds of the feather or homophile effect, the concept that similar attract similar. And this is a well-established finding in social psychology. As a field begins to lean a certain way, the field will likely become increasingly attractive to people suited to that learning. Over time, the group itself may become characterized by its group members. Professors and scientists may come to be seen as liberal, just as nurses are typically thought of as being female. Once that happens, conservatives may disproportionately self-select out of joining the dissimilar group based on a realistic perception that they do not fit in well. As our authors then go on to note, self-selection clearly plays a role, but it would be ironic if an epistemic community resonated to empirical arguments that appear to exonerate the community of prejudice, when that same community roundly rejects those same arguments when invoked by other institutions to explain the underrepresentation of women or ethnic minorities, e.g. in STEM disciplines or other elite professions. Indeed, there would be a glorious and delicious irony if that were the case. Well, conservatives and right-wingers just don't want to enter these fields of study, but women and ethnic minorities are totally forced out of other professions by straight white men, because patriarchy. And of course, this process of self-selection could potentially lead to a hostile climate. Consider the narrative of conservatives that can be formed from some recent conclusions in social psychological research. Compared to liberals, conservatives are less intelligent and less cognitively complex. They are more rigid, dogmatic, and inflexible. Their lower IQ explains their racism and sexism, and their endorsement of inequality explains why they are happier than liberals. They are hyper-responsive to threatening and negative stimuli, and they adopt their political beliefs in part to assuage their fears and anxieties. These conclusions do not remain confined to academic journals. They are widely reported in the press and in popular books about why conservatives deny science. And there's plenty of evidence for this hostile climate, and it's not just anecdotal. Imbar and Lamar's 2012 asked members of the SPSP discussion list, do you feel there is a hostile climate towards your political beliefs in your field? Of 17 conservatives, 14, 82% responded yes, with half of those responding very much. In contrast, only 18 of the 266 liberals, 7%, responded yes, with only 2 of those responding very much. Interestingly, 18 of 25 moderates, 72%, responded yes, with 1 responding very much. This surprising result suggests that the hostile climate may adversely affect not only conservatives, but anyone who is not liberal or whose values do not align with the liberal progressive narrative. And this is not where the discrimination train ends. There have been several studies in which liberal professors have been asked to rate the publishability of various manuscripts. All of the studies referenced within this paper find a similar pattern, with one such example where research proposals hypothesizing either reverse discrimination, i.e. against white males, or conventional discrimination, i.e. against ethnic minorities, when submitted to 150 internal review boards, everything else about the proposal was held constant. The reverse discrimination proposals were approved less often than the conventional discrimination proposals. That is to say, everything about those papers was identical. The only thing that was changed was discrimination against ethnic minorities to discrimination against white people. And yet the discrimination against white people was published less often, when all other variables were equal. And yet that is not the most shocking part of this paper. We're going to cover that right now. In two field studies conducted by Inbar and Lamars in 2012, they found that most social psychologists who responded to their survey were willing to explicitly state that they would discriminate against conservatives. Their survey posed the question: if two job candidates with equal qualifications were to apply for an opening in your department and you knew that one was politically quite conservative, do you think you would be inclined to vote for the more liberal one? Of the 237 liberals, only 42, 18% chose the lowest scale point of not at all. In other words, 82% admitted that they would be at least a little bit prejudiced against a conservative candidate, and 43% chose the midpoint somewhat or above. In contrast, the majority of moderates, 67%, and conservatives, 83%, chose the lowest scale point of not at all. Absolutely shocking and slightly terrifying. So the kinds of behavior that we see from modern regressive leftists and certain sects of feminism and social justice, with their violent hatred of any sort of outgroup that they can find, seems to carry over to the professional sphere of academia. And I do believe that this paper also helps to partially highlight why the go-to insult for so many of them is to call someone a conservative, or to call them right-wing, or to call them a reactionary. It does appear to be as an explicit result of inbuilt confirmation biases in their own world view, which has been informed by biased research from a one-sided academic institution. If you'd like to look through this paper in your own time, I do highly encourage you to do so. We've looked at probably only around about a third of it in this video, as I said earlier, for the sake of brevity. But I think we've got all of the key points in there. Just a note that if you wish to get this paper, you will require an academic login, or you'll have to pay to have access to it. But it is thoroughly worth it. So the next time someone tries to tell you that feminism or social justice isn't infesting academia, turning it into a glorious biased echo chamber, and that anyone who claims this is just a conservative, reactionary, right-wing conspiracy theorist, you now have the tools, the knowledge, and the statistics at your disposal to tell them that they are objectively wrong.